Kristine Weber is a yoga therapist and an advanced yoga teacher. She's a leading authority on the neuroscientific benefits of slow, mindful yoga and an advocate for the use of these practices as an integral part of the solution to the healthcare crisis. She's leading the charge to get slow, mindful practices to people who desperately need them through her Subtle Yoga Revolution series of online courses and trainings. These trainings have been praised by thousands all over the world. Her organization, Subtle Health, provides holistic yoga-based trainings, education, and clinical services with the mission of enhancing community health infrastructure. She's the director of the Subtle Yoga Teacher Training for Behavioral Health Professionals program at MAHEC in Asheville, North Carolina. She presents workshops and trainings internationally and is frequently invited to speak about yoga at healthcare conferences. And boy, do we know they need it. Kristine is the author of the Healing Self-Massage and has published articles in Yoga Therapy Practice and other wellness publications. Her work has been featured in Redbook, Body Sense, Women's World, Natural Health, and Lifetime TV. And her website is subtleyoga.com. So thank you very much, Kristine, for joining us and sharing your knowledge and skills and giving us tips to all of us. And without further ado, I'd let you start.
Okay. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for being here. I know there's lots of other things you could be doing tonight or whatever time it is where you are. And I so appreciate you being here to talk about yoga, to talk about the benefits of yoga, the neurobiologic benefits of yoga. I want to start by just telling you a little story. When I was in 6th grade, I was a typical 12 or 13-year-old and didn't really, really kind of understand who I was at that point. And I had a social studies teacher, Miss Gale, who had big glasses and long curly hair, and she didn't shave her legs, and she wore flowy skirts and what we would call Birkenstocks today. And she taught yoga. She had a yoga club on Wednesday afternoons when I was in 6th grade. And this is in the late 70s, so I would go to her yoga club on Wednesday afternoons, and everybody kind of made fun of it because she was a hippie and it was kind of a hippie thing to do yoga. But what I noticed, and I didn't have a context, I didn't even have a way to explain it, but I noticed at the end of yoga class when we would lie down flat and she would start counting backwards from 20 for us, and she would tell us to see everything in different lights and different colors and different shapes. And she would guide us through this guided relaxation. And I would have these almost like out-of-body experiences as a little, just barely adolescent little kid. And I couldn't talk about it because I didn't understand what it was, but I knew there was something very special in those practices. And that sort of was like the beginning of my journey. Of course, I left yoga for a while and came back, and, I had a dance with the practice for a while until I was in my 20s, and I spent some time in Asia. I lived there for about 4 years. And I went to India and really seriously studied the practices. And when I came back to the United States, I realized this is the future of what humanity needs. I mean, it's the past, of course. There's certainly a lot of present involved in what is happening with yoga. But I sort of understood about 30 years ago it was 25 years ago when I came back, that there was something very important in these practices, and I needed to share them with other people. And I think right now we're at this incredible point in history, everybody knows that, where we're called, these practices, maybe they were like a good idea before COVID. Maybe they were, like nice, healthy habit to have. But now we're starting to understand that actually whatever we can do to build up our resilience, to build up the strength in our body, we're called to do that right now. because we don't know what we could encounter, particularly those of you in the United States. It's a very, we know that it's a very dangerous, a very precarious time. And so I don't see yoga right now. I mean, I have been advocating for yoga as a public health strategy for many years, but I don't see yoga right now as just a hobby. I see it as a public health strategy. Let's get as strong as we can. Let's be as resilient as we can. Let's learn how to regulate the nervous system, and to damp down that anxiety that's is bubbling up so much. A couple of weeks ago, I saw in the news that 30% of Americans are struggling with some kind of mental health challenge. So yes, we need professional care. Of course, we need licensed professional care for mental health challenges. Of course, we need it for physical challenges. I would never suggest to anyone that if you do yoga, you won't get COVID, but it is very important right now to have practices that give us a sense of agency, a sense of this internal sense of strength, that we can get through, we can be resilient, we can bounce back, we can get through whatever we need to get through. So today's presentation is kind of just a little taste of some of the work I've been doing for a few years. And I want to give you some good references for more information if you're interested. And just sort of a look into this connection between yoga practices and the neuroscience, so that we can better understand why yoga is so preventative. It's certainly a prevention strategy. Why yoga is so powerful for creating neuroplastic changes in the brain, and why we should think about it scaling, not just as an individual practice for wealthy suburban white women, but as a possibility to scale for the health of all people, how we can reach more people. Now, I'm going to share a few slides with you, and what I want to say as I'm sharing these slides, and by the way, we will have time at the end for some questions, but I'm going to share a few slides with you. And what I want to start out by saying is that I am not a scientist. I do have a journalism background. So, I come at this, but I do have science advisors who help me kind of tease out the information. So, I come at this more from a research perspective, in terms of like a journalist way of looking at the research. I've curated the research, you could say. I am in the process of doing some research right now here locally in Asheville, looking at the subtle yoga practices and how they can be beneficial for folks in early recovery from addiction challenges. But, I don't have a science background. So any mistakes that I make, I take full responsibility for them. And I'm happy to have anyone who wants to correct, feel free. You got the chat box, correct if there's any mistakes here. Okay, so let's get rolling. The first thing I want to talk about, because what my expertise is actually yoga. And the first thing I want to talk about is the challenge of looking at the brain. Because, for 200, 300, 400 years, we thought the brain didn't change, and we didn't understand it at all, really, until functional MRIs came on the scene. We started to have a little bit more of a glimpse. I think this quote kind of sums it up, that Ian Stewart is a science writer and mathematician in England. And, this idea that if our brains were so simple, that were simple enough that we could understand them, we would be too simple that we couldn't understand them. We would be so simple that we couldn't understand them. So let's remember, when I started really looking into the brain, it's about 10 years ago, I learned some things. And then I started to find that the science started to change. So the science is evolving, the science is changing. We know what we know, but we also don't know what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. And we're starting to gain a greater and greater understanding, but we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of reductivism, reductionism, because that's the framework that we swim in. As Western people, we have been schooled, we have been taught to look at our lives, to look at ourselves, to look at our bodies, our minds as, sort of like a car coming up from from the material up. And that framework that we swim in is called scientific materialism. Science is wonderful, science is great, but we have to be clear, science is not devoid of bias. Science is biased by the framework, which is scientific materialism, which says, it's matter that causes things to happen. It's matter getting increasingly complex that causes human beings to evolve. And the problem with scientific materialism is that it's reductive. We break things down to try and understand them, right? Another problem with it is it's materialistic. We value the material. We look down into the elements and see how they put themselves together. And then the complexity that emerges from that is largely unexplained. We don't really understand emergent properties. We don't really understand complexity theory. The self in this framework is fundamentally matter. Your brain is a bunch of neurons that have come together somehow for some reason. And then your mind is an epiphenomenon of the brain. Your mind is coming out of your brain according to this paradigm. That's not the same thing in other paradigms. And then consciousness is something that we can't really explain. The brain science is quite limited in its understanding of things like consciousness, of understanding even memory. We have no idea where memories live in the brain. There's many things about the human mind that brain science can't explain. And so you may have heard the expression, the mind is what the brain does. That's a very materialistic perspective. Other people may say, no, the brain is just the brain comes out of the mind. The brain develops because of the mind's existence. That would be more of an Eastern perspective. I'll talk about that momentarily. So we might know that these things are not entirely true. We kind of feel like, well, maybe I'm more than just the sum of my parts. However, from a Western perspective, that's what we tend to default to. And so, for example, things like we say, oh, we don't have enough serotonin in the system. Somehow there's not enough serotonin in the gap between the dendrites and the axon. We don't have enough serotonin there. So because we don't have enough serotonin, we know serotonin makes you happy. We'll develop this drug called selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and that'll solve the problem of depression. Now, that doesn't mean that some people don't do really well on SSRIs. Some people do quite well on them. But it does mean that that is a reductive, and very scientific, materialistic, biased way of looking at who we are as human beings. So as wonderful as brain science is for helping us to understand and for helping us to create a link between Western science and the Eastern wisdom traditions, we have to be mindful that it's not fully developed yet. We don't really understand it. And things are changing all the time. So now, when we look at the way that yoga thinks about knowing, about life, yoga epistemology, if you like, how we think, it's different than scientific materialism. It's a different worldview. The worldview is holistic and synthetic. It doesn't break things up into parts. In fact, it tries to build things up to find the unity in things. And causality is consciousness rather than matter. It's almost the opposite. It's like there's in the yoga philosophies and many of and the Indian traditions, the idea is that the universe is a universe of desire, and the human being forms this complex neuroendocrine structure because it needs to house this ever increasing desire for more consciousness. We desire to expand. I mean, this is sort of the fundamental idea of in many of the Indian philosophies. We desire this capacity to expand so much that we expand into the ocean of Brahman, or this ocean of oneness. And so it's quite a different, understanding than the scientific materialistic framework. It's quite a different worldview. One of the ways that this is explained in the traditional Indian text is by what's called the theory of the shariras, or the three-body theory. The idea is that the spirit causes mind and mind causes matter. So I'll show you a little picture of this. So the causal body, which is called the Karana Sharira, the body that's sort of the part of ourselves that desires physical existence so that we can have experience, so that we can grow, so that we can transform. That creates what's called the subtle body, which you could think about as sort of an energetic scaffolding around which the physical body will form. And you can also think about it as holding the seeds of the samskaras or karmic imprints, this idea of like holding the desires, if you like, within it. And therefore it's going to produce a physical body that is the perfect body for you to express those desires, to walk through life and learn the exact lessons that are the perfect lessons for you to learn. So you can see this is quite inverted from a scientific materialistic perspective. You know, we don't need to mix the models. We don't need to, you know, force the models to fit with each other. But when we have an idea of the framework that and how we think, when we have an idea of the water that we swim in, you know, sort of like a fish doesn't know it's swimming in water. It's that kind of idea. When we have an idea, like, actually, this is how I think in terms of Western materialism, it can help us to examine that framework and whether or not it's useful, right? So the traditional framework from South Asia, from India, gives us another perspective, a different perspective on who we are. Now, what I'd also like to offer here is that the paradigm of neuroscience is beginning to shift as well. And, you know, you could trace this back to really to the physicists, if you like. And many of the physicists, like in the early part of the 20th century, were starting to have interactions with, for example, Rabindranath Tagore, who was one of the great saints, one of the great yogis of the early 20th century, had interactions with some of the physicists because he was trained at Oxford. And so, you know, you can go back in science a century or so and start to see that people were starting to think differently about science and starting to incorporate some of the ideas that went beyond scientific materialism. And just to be clear, there's very important reasons why Western scientists had to abandon a lot of the superstitions, a lot of the myths, because, you know, those were not many of the treatments, like in the 1800s or 1700s, arsenic and lead and things that they used, you know, they found that they were toxic, and they had to form they had to find a worldview that was actually going to be effective for helping people. So the 19th century was a century of infectious diseases. And that Western science was wonderful at starting to learn in the early 20th century how to eradicate those infectious diseases. The 20th century, particularly the latter half of the 20th century, was a century of chronic diseases. And Western science has not been so good at addressing them. And partly it's because our worldview is so reductive, you know. So anyway, the worldview is starting to shift. We're shifting from reductivism to more systems thinking, like systems biology, for example. We're shifting from the brain being fixed to this idea that, no, there's something called neuroplasticity. You know, when I was in high school, some of you might remember this if you're American, there was an advertisement for, it was like a, you know, Just Say No. It was before Just Say No, but it was an anti-drug advertisement. And there was, you know, there was this frying pan, and this guy had an egg, and he was like, "This is your brain." And then he cracks the egg and puts it in a frying pan. "This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?" You know. And so I remember being in high school, and the messages that we got were, once you burn those brain cells, that's it, you're done. You don't grow new brain cells, nothing, you know, you're going to hurt your brain. And that was the dominant understanding. But in the past 20, 25 years, we started to learn, no, actually there is such a thing as neurogenesis. In certain parts of the brain, neurons grow. And then also there's neuroplasticity. The brain can change, and which is really exciting. It means that if your brain can change, you know, you can change. Another dominant paradigm is like there's these areas of your brain, like, for example, it's your insular cortex or your prefrontal cortex, and they do certain things. But now we're starting to say, actually, the whole brain is participating in lots of things, and neural networks are a lot more important than just the different structures, the different parts of the brain. So that's starting to change. Also, we're moving from this brain-centric thing, like, you know how many times you've seen on TV like somebody with a jar and a brain in it, and it's like, you know, you can take that brain and sci-fi and you can put it in somebody else's body, Frankenstein sort of thing. Well, actually we're starting to realize like that's so erroneous, because we're thinking the brain, we're so we live so much up here that we assume the brain is controlling everything, but actually the brain is distributed. It's distributed throughout your body. I mean, you can't really talk about the brain without talking about the rest of the nervous system. The other bias we had was like neurotransmitter bias, and now we're moving into looking at, wait a minute, it's not just about this chemical interaction and the neurotransmitters. It's also, there's other things going on there, like glial cells are the support cells for the neurons. And we used to think that glial cells were just like glue. That glial means glue, just kind of held things together. Now they're like, actually, these glial cells are doing electrical things in the body, and they're actually important, and there's scientists that are trying to figure out what's going on with the glial cells. So there's an emerging paradigm. Things are shifting, and that's kind of exciting, because we're starting to see that actually the paradigm can shift. As consciousness expands, I mean, this is what the yogis would say, as consciousness expands, of course the paradigms are going to change, because we're on this evolutionary pathway. So, so yoga gives us a holistic perspective on human existence. I just talked about one model. By the way, there's many models in the yoga tradition, but that's one model, like the three bodies, causal, subtle, and gross. So it gives us another perspective, and advances in neuroscience are enabling us to better understand the mechanisms behind the yoga practices, why they work. That's what really fires me up. That's what I feel really excited about. And I think the potential for this study is both really broad and really deep. And we're just getting rolling. You know, one of the things that happened like in 1969, this guy, Dr. Kenneth Cooper, came out with a book. It was called Aerobics, and he sparked the aerobics revolution, you know. And so for 51 years, we've been getting these messages like, you have to exercise, cardiovascular exercise is so important, right? And it is. I mean, there's numerous studies about the benefits of cardiovascular exercise. Now, what scientists just started to study in the early 2000s really is mindfulness. And in the later 2000s, like 2006, 2008, we started to see the emergence of research that's showing the benefits of mindfulness in the body, which we can call interoceptive awareness. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But what this study is starting to show us, it's starting the development of a whole new form of self-care, which is slow and mindful and pays attention to the needs of the body and brings self-compassion and kindness, and starting to develop a friendship with the body, which is quite different than, you know, Nike Just Do It and no pain, no gain and all that stuff that has been so bombarded into our culture for so long. So I think yoga teachers, yoga professionals are in a unique position to help bring this work to the forefront of self-care, and that slow, mindful yoga practices are just as valid, just as important for self-care as the cardiovascular exercise stuff. Of course, there's some crossover, but I like to create kind of this dichotomy so people go, oh, exercise is really good, but inner size is also really important, and I need to prioritize that in my life. If I want to create resilience, I need both in my life. So I want to define yoga here, because that's an issue, right? So some folks think that yoga means asana, right? Just these yoga posture practice, and that's one aspect of it. But yoga also, the foundation of yoga is ethics and actually moral principles, which are called the yamas and niyamas. So this is from the Raja Yoga system, but also you see it in many of the other iterations of traditional iterations of yoga. Ethics are the foundation. Without ethics, the rest of the system kind of falls apart. So we have opportunity to reflect on our interactions with others, with ourselves. Asanas mean yoga postures, pranayama means breathing practices, and then meditation, of course. And if you look at the traditional 8-limb system, meditation is half of that system. So sometimes people say, I practice yoga and meditation. Well, you know, I would suggest if you practice yoga, then the meditation is part of it. This definition comes from an article. I have the source, the citation rather, at the end of this presentation, that was published in 2014 by a group of researchers around the United States and in a few other countries who are trying to come together and start to tease out the neural biological mechanisms that underpin yoga that benefit mental health. And so it's a wonderful article. If you want to go a little deeper, I will be referencing it a little bit more. But let's take a moment here and go into the brain a little bit. Now, because we only have an hour, usually what I do is start like talking about what the brain does, you know, but we only have an hour, so this is just a really quickie. And I love to use this hand model of the brain to talk about the brain. So if you'd like, you can do it with me. You hold your hand up, you hold your brain and your hand up. And this part of the brain is the hindbrain and the brainstem. And then if you tuck your thumb in, it kind of looks a little bit like the cingulate cortex, and it's going to represent the limbic part of the brain, which has to do a lot with emotional aspects. And then if you wrap your fingers around, you see all these little spaces between, kind of looks a little bit like the cortex. And so those are the kind of the triune brain, or the three parts of the brain. I like to use this as a psychoeducational tool. It helps people to understand, you know, this is how you want your brain to work. You want your front brain to be doing its thing, helping to regulate the limbic brain, and you want all of it to be integrated so that the brainstem can do its thing. This is from Dr. Dan Siegel, by the way. So when we flip our lids, you know, that's when you go into emotional brain. And when you lose the emotional brain, that's when you go into numbness and shut down, just brainstem survival stuff. So we want everything to be integrated. We want to walk around with our little hand model of the brain. Now, what I'm going to do, I wanted to show you that because what I'm going to do is like take you through what yoga can do for each part of that brain. Okay, so what does yoga do for the hindbrain? So you think about the hindbrain, it has to do with like respiration and your heart rate and all the metabolism, all the things that are going on in your body that keep you alive, right? So how does it optimize the function of the hindbrain? It does things like improve balance. You have to be able to stand up, right, and walk around. And everybody needs to practice balancing on one foot. Maybe not this posture, but there's lots of other postures we do where we practice balances. And then things like better coordination and muscle strength and respiratory and cardiovascular function. We also know that it helps the hindbrain. The reason I put addiction recovery here is because there are parts of the brain, the nucleus accumbens and the VTA, that get hijacked by addictive processes, and they're very much related to the survival part of the brain. So and then they're related to limbic structures as well, of course, but I thought it was really important to put this in the hindbrain because sometimes those processes are, you know, the survival process gets hijacked. So so that's one idea of how yoga can help the hindbrain. What can you do? You can do balance poses. There's lots of things you can do. You can use inversions. Inversions are great because they trick what's called the baroreceptors. Baroreceptors are in your carotid arteries and in your heart, and they're like regulating what's going on with your blood pressure. You want to challenge them sometimes with inversions that can help the nervous. It releases a cascade of neurochemicals to help the nervous system down regulate the sympathetic part of the nervous system. So help you be more, feel a little bit more relaxed. And then twist poses, forward bending poses help to support the neurons that we have in the gut brain, right? Which is very much related to how we're feeling about the world, fear, anxiety, those sorts of things. So we have lots of practices. Many of the yoga practices actually are very interested in helping the digestive system and the gut brain. So the other piece, and it's more complicated than that, but I hope that gives you the basics. Now the other piece here is the midbrain. That's not this part, that's limbic. So this area here is the limbic brain. But midbrain, I think, is an important part of the brain to talk about because the midbrain does actually do a couple of things. It's involved in it's kind of the connection, of course, between the front brain and the hindbrain, but it does some things with autonomic function. It's also involved in seeing and hearing and orienting. Very important. Orienting is like, where am I right now and am I safe, which is called neuroception. It's involved in dopamine production. Dopamine has a lot to do with seeking behavior and, you know, like feeling satisfied. Well, it's looking for something to satisfy you. And also, the midbrain is also related to some very deep preverbal emotional impressions like fear and shame and love and comfort and grief and rage. It's the parts of the brain are called the superior colliculi and the periaqueductal gray. And that's information from Dr. Frank Corrigan, who's a Scottish psychiatrist and neuroscientist. And he started to recognize that there were deep parts of the midbrain involved in the orienting response that get into patterns and are related to our traumatic patterning, are related to our mental health. And so yoga can help the brain to function better. Things like, you know, improving coordination, reducing stress, promoting addiction recovery again, and also optimizing structures that help to bring what is unconscious into consciousness. Because the midbrain, some of that stuff is unconscious. You may have feelings of rage, but until it's coordinated with front brain systems, we might just act out on it. So that's where you get the mindfulness stuff, paying attention to my responses to things. Yoga is amazing for helping us to develop those mindfulness skills. Okay, and then some suggestions for using yoga for the midbrain. Move slowly, use a lot of awareness. Listening to the sound of your breath as you practice can be very helpful. Noticing sensations in your body, using simple neck movements, which can help to soothe the orienting response. Dr. Corrigan talks about even just placing your hands on the back of your neck when you feel that pre-verbal primal emotions emerging to support the awareness, bringing awareness to the orienting response. And so simple neck movements. I also do a lot of eye movements to help with the midbrain too, in the sense, because the eyes are part of what's called the orienting response, right? Where am I right now? Am I safe? So lots of eye movements and neck movements are helpful for the midbrain. Okay, and then, you know, I'm talking about the emotion, I'm talking about the limbic brain a little bit with the forebrain, because they're kind of in the same area. They're considered part of the same part of the brain. So yoga practices can help to optimize the function of the forebrain, the front part of the brain, right, prefrontal cortex and other parts of the forebrain, particularly in their ability to train attention and improve executive function. Now, according to Dr. Dan Siegel, there's 4 ways that the brain changes. Attention is right there on the top of the list. When you pay attention to something, you start to create new neural patterning. So what if you pay attention to yourself? What if you pay attention to sensations? That starts to change the brain. So attention is important, repetition is important. And then the kind of yoga that I teach, which comes from Desikachar's lineage, Vini yoga, and then my own iteration of what I call subtle yoga, we do a lot of repetition. In Kirti's style of yoga from the Kundalini practice, it's all about repetition, because repetition then starts to make changes in the brain. We all know that. I think if you ever learn to play a musical instrument, it's all about the repetition, right? So repetition is important. So it's attention, it's repetition, and then novelty. So you want little new things that you pay attention to. You know, when something new comes, like the newest iPhone, I pay attention, right? So that's the novelty is really important for making brain changes. And then the last part is interest or passion. So one of my favorite researchers named Holger Kramer who's in Germany, yoga researchers, he says, you know, he has a couple of quotes he says about yoga. He says, slow mindful yoga is very important for healing depression. He says that. But in another article, he says, the best kind of yoga is the kind of yoga that you're going to do. Right, so we don't have to like argue with each other about the best kind of yoga. We know the kind of yoga that we like, that we're interested in, we have some passion for it. That's what helps us to elicit these neuroplastic changes in the brain. Okay, so front brain stuff, it has a lot to do with attention, has a lot to do with that executive function, you know, rational thinking. There was a research study that measured cognitive performance in 2 groups, one yoga and one aerobic exercise. And what the study showed, it was that after the yoga practice, cognitive performance was significantly superior to the exercise group. Can you think about why, right? Exercise, you don't have to think. You can put your headphones on, get on your Peloton bike or whatever, and get and sweat. You don't have to pay attention. In yoga, the challenge is pay attention. Should take that awareness inside, mindfulness in the body, and that's where we start to see significant changes. So studies like this are just starting to emerge, to differentiating between yoga, and typically they're looking at yoga practices that are slower, that are more mindful, not the fast, sweaty vinyasa stuff. Although there's some really good studies on that stuff too. So if that's the yoga that you like, great. And I'll also say, to create map differentiation in the brain, you have maps all over your brain of the body, and insular cortex, and even in the, I think it's in the thalamus, I'll have to check, but you have maps all over your brain. And what neuroscientist and writer Norman Doidge talks about is that it's slow, mindful movement that creates better map differentiation, and so that more change is possible. And I think I might have that quote in the presentation, but if I don't, his book is called The Brain That Changes Itself. So there is something, to make that distinction again between exercise and exercise. I think it's an important distinction so that folks understand, don't just work out for 90 minutes and then do Shavasana and you did yoga. Use this or workout without paying any attention. Use the opportunity to go inside, use the opportunity to pay attention, build mindfulness in the body. Now there's one more part of the brain I want to talk about, which is this lovely structure that runs between the hemispheres. There's a couple of things that go between the hemispheres, but the most dominant one is this part called the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is the structure that connects the right and left hemisphere of the brain, the forebrain, the cerebrum. And it's very important because the brain is lateralized. That means there are different things happening in different sides of your brain, and you need them to work together, right? We need them to be able to communicate with each other. So there are yoga practices that can kind of support that communication. I'll talk about that in a moment. So what are some yoga practices for the forebrain? Focused attention, using breath and movement. When you focus on your breath, oh my gosh, there's so much interesting research out there about how focusing on your breath changes the nervous system. Like almost any kind of breath awareness starts to move the nervous system towards, or downregulate the sympathetic part of the nervous system and move the nervous system into more of a parasympathetic state. So when we use attention, we use breath, we use movement, it really helps us to promote, this integrated optimization use of the brain. And by the way, yoga has both top down and bottom up. So it's not just the body, it's not just somatic. But what about when you use movement and awareness with a sense of kindness for yourself, with a sense of, openness, if you like, generosity, curiosity, like you have intentions, these sort of expansive intentions. That's when we start to make really powerful integrated loops between those top down and bottom up shifts. Okay, so and then you can use things like Samkalpa. We talk about that in yoga practice, which means intention, which means sort of taking going into your practice with a specific idea in your mind and using that to stimulate the attention networks. I said as well as default networks because so there's this thing between attention networks and default networks. Attention networks, some are considered sort of like when you're focused, there's a lot of research on them in mindfulness meditation. And then there's the default networks, which for a long time people said were bad. They're ruminative networks. But it turns out the default networks are not bad. They're creative. But if you have negative feedback loops going on in your brain and you're playing that, tape over and over again, then yeah, the default networks are bad. So we can use attention networks to kind of shift the default networks. We can use yoga practices to bring feelings of kindness and safety into the body so that the default networks kind of calm down a little bit and start to bias more in a positive direction, more towards creativity, more towards, creating something new, expanding the way that you're thinking about things as opposed to, those negative self-talk stuff that comes from childhood for many of us. And then the next point is focus attention on sensations and the interpretation of them. to challenge the insular cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex, there's some really fascinating information about how it's involved in empathy and impulse control and decision making. The insular cortex is such a fascinating part of your brain. Like if you could take your brain and kind of pull the curtain back on the cerebrum, there's a little cortical island in there on both sides. It's called the insula. And the back part of the insula is largely related to processes that are very below the level of consciousness. Like, you know, do I need to regulate my temperature, for example, cool down a little bit, you know, it has more to do with that more brainstem sort of stuff. And then it starts to shift as you move towards the anterior part of the insular cortex, and you get into things like, I think I have to pee, or, you know, I'm kind of hungry. You start getting into sort of some awareness. And then when you get up to the front part of the insula, as it connects to the front brain, now I'm starting to know how I feel. And I'm starting to use mindful awareness to know how I feel. Why is that so important? Because when I know how I feel, I can make good decisions about what to do. You know, I work a lot with people with addiction challenges. What happens is people don't know how they feel. And so they're driven by these unconscious patterns that say just use the substance, right? As you start to develop the skill of knowing how you feel, then you can make good choices about what to do in your life, you know? And this starts to translate into something even deeper, which is now I know who I am. When you know who you are, you start to develop a sense of identity, a sense of meaning and purpose in your life. Now your life starts to feel so rich and so much potential. Anything is possible. So these practices where you go inside and you notice, which is called interoception, have just an incredibly broad potential for changing the individual, for changing the culture. And we don't teach them anywhere, you know, except yoga, and a little bit in, you know, some of the other Asian practices, some of the other martial practices, and certainly mindfulness. But this is something that needs to shift in the whole culture, right? The last thing I'm saying is use cross-crawl movements. Cross-crawl movements means opposite arm and leg, and bilateral, you know, it could be bilateral stimulation, but I don't want to go there, it's too much. But like left arm, right leg, right arm, left leg, those sorts of things. We do all that stuff in yoga all the time. So that's cross-crawl. And then, or rather, that's contralateral. And then cross-lateral is things that we do where we cross the midline. And we do that a lot in yoga too, just like in a twist, you cross the midline, right? So those things are giving the corpus callosum a little challenge, because it's like my right hemisphere and my left hemisphere have to be working at the same time, building more connectivity across the hemispheres. Okay, so this is my little rundown, which is actually from Satbir Khalsa, dear friend who's at Harvard and just an amazing researcher. So he put this list together. He said, how does yoga help, you know, neurobiologically and psychologically? Improving vagal tone. I'm not going to like go deep into each of these for time reasons, but you can look, you know, you're welcome to go deeper. So vagal tone has a lot to do with how resilient the nervous system is. Increases heart rate variability, same thing. That's how they measure vagal tone, is how good is your heart rate variability. Has to do with your heart's capacity to adapt to different situations. Increases dopamine, serotonin, melatonin, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which has a lot to do with like preserving the neurons so they don't die. Oxytocin, which is like the love hormone, the potion of devotion, and then endorphins, the body's endogenous opiates, right? And then decreases the stress hormones, or at least makes them function a little better. Everybody needs cortisol, but we don't need, you know, to spike at the wrong times of the day. Activates attention networks, reduces emotional reactivity, reduces dysfunctional thoughts, induces long-term changes in brain activity and structure, increases attention regulation, increases mind-body awareness, mindfulness, resilience, and enhances positive psychological characteristics. And my favorite, induces trance flow and contemplative states. I mean, that's kind of what I was talking about in my 6th grade yoga class, where I had these kind of out-of-body experiences with my teacher. So that's from Satbir, who's at Harvard. He's been doing research on yoga for a long time, and he's really like one of the rock stars in the yoga therapy world. Okay, so yoga and neuroplasticity. So I just wanted to show you this quote, which is from Helen Lavretsky at UCLA. And what she said is, in a way, both yoga and meditation are brain exercises, right? See, she divided them up. I would keep them together. But anyway, yoga is a brain exercise that engages different parts of the brain on the components of practice: breathing, movement, postures, chanting, visualization, meditation, or concentration, and can help the brain form new connections and recover from injuries, or as we like to call it, stimulate neuroplasticity. So I just thought that was such a great quote. I can't not include it. And then I'm going to give you just a little quick kind of summary of some of the things that change in like the structural parts of the brain that change. So we know number one is prefrontal cortex shifts, and the functional shift would be more awareness. This is from a study from the National Institute of Health, which, by the way, I have referenced in the bottom of the presentation. And then interoception and exteroception. So interoception, I've been talking about it. This is about getting to know yourself better, right? Tuning in to what's going on. So we know that we see structural changes in the insula as well as the sensory motor cortex. Exteroception is like, how are things going out there, and am I aware if I'm safe? So, and that has something to do with proprioception and neuroception and some of those things. And then memory integration, we know that the hippocampus, we increase the hippocampus volume, the gray matter volume, which is helpful for reducing the reactivity of what's called the amygdala, which is the brain's kind of smoke detector. So we kind of help the amygdala activity to reduce. And then we also have the better self-regulation, better emotional regulation, which has to do with the anterior cingulate cortex, and also this wonderful part of the brain that goes right from your third eye kind of back under the, or on top of the orbit of the eyes, the orbital frontal cortex, which has, studies have shown that meditation creates more gray matter in that area. And then the last one is this better hemispheric communication, which I've already talked about with the corpus callosum. Okay, so I'm just trying to make sure we have time for questions. I want to break down from Tim Gard's article, which was about this research-based theory of the benefits of yoga. So what is yoga? Thankfully, the Kripalu Research Consortium defined yoga as meditation, ethics, postures, and pranayama. And these practices lead to top-down capacity. The top-down capacity, I'm going to start over here: attention, memory, monitoring, awareness, and even they talked about the moral cognition network, improving our capacity for really actualizing or operationalizing our values. And then we have these bottom-up skills as well, which are more the somatic skills. So anyway, I wanted to show you this decreasing stress in the top-down. But the bottom-up is more somatic, and so coming from the body, like the vagus nerve, heart rate variability, baroreception, respiration, and also this extinction learning, meaning you're unlearning the stuff that wasn't healthy for you. And this leads to decreased pain and inflammation. So we have bottom up that leads to, top down that leads to decreased stress, increased resilience, bottom up, decreased inflammation and pain. There's also a piece here about the somatic processing, interoception, proprioception, balance, better cardiovascular function. And all of that leads to essentially these three wonderful benefits of pro-social behavior, playing well with others, I like to say, better psychological health, and greater physical health as well. So this article, you're welcome to look it up. It's got a much more complicated model than this, but I broke it down just to make it a little bit easier to understand. So I want to talk, just kind of wrap this up with yoga across the healthcare continuum, because that's how I started the conversation, right? That yoga can be beneficial in healthcare, right? There are many studies that show yoga is beneficial for prevention, and many studies that show that yoga is beneficial even for treatment. But these 4 areas are considered by the public health people the areas of healthcare. You know, treatment gets 90% of the healthcare dollars in the United States, but the Institute of Medicine, which is now the National Academies of Sciences, says that actually health promotion should be occurring in everything. Like, we need to promote health in treatment and prevention and in recovery, whether it's recovery from addiction, whether it's recovery from chronic illnesses. So this, I want to show you the levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is called the, we took this from what's called the social ecological model. This is my model. I took it from the social ecological model. Like, yoga shouldn't just happen for individuals. We also need to talk about families and organizations and the community, and how do we get this work out to more people who need it. And then we want to talk about these outcomes. I've already mentioned it a bit. And then the middle part is the part of human existence that goes beyond the material, the mind, body, and spirit, the physical, the mental, and the spiritual, because there's a large body and growing body of research about the benefits of spirituality for health. And so we don't want to ignore that. Yoga is so wonderful at helping people access and operationalize their spirituality, used in the context of any spiritual belief system or lack of spiritual belief system, and working, with any idea of, people who believe are more atheists but still understand the interconnectedness of all things can benefit as well. Okay, so I think that's my last slide. Yes, phew. Okay, if I've been talking about a minute. So let me stop sharing my slides here. Well, let me just let you see this first before I stop sharing my slides. So here's a way to reach me. I'm on Facebook. I have a Facebook group called Subtle Yoga with Kristine Weber. Actually, it's my Facebook page. I have a Facebook group called Subtle Yoga Community. You're welcome to join. Lots of great discussion going on over there. And every Wednesday, I do a little practice tip video, live video. I'm at Twitter, I'm on Instagram. And then I do have, thank you for being here. And I do have a little freebie for being here, which is my free class called Subtle Yoga for Greater Nervous System Resilience and Brain Function. And it also has a stick figure cheat sheet of the practices. So if you go to go.subtleyoga.com/yoga -class, or if you have this electronically, if you have the handouts electronically, just click on there. That will take you to a little sign up page and you'll get a free class. So thank you for being here and for listening. And I'm happy to take some questions now. Oh, these are my references, but you have them if you have the handout.
So just to clarify, we will be sending the slides to everyone at the end of this presentation. Actually, give us a day or so. We're going to do the editing of the video, and we'll send you the link to the video recording. And that will also include the slides that Kristine has so kindly agreed to give to you. So I know there was a lot of things to write, and thank you so much, Kristine. I also wanted to remind everyone that the foundation, we're kind of running out of time here, but the foundation has an online, entirely online brain longevity therapy training. And you can access it at www.arpf, like Alzheimer's Research and Prevention Foundation, .com. And we're offering it now during this COVID crisis for a week or so. We're offering it at discounted price. So check it out at arpf.com. And we have like 3 minutes. Can you, let's see, I have a question. Tell us quickly how you became interested in this work and your journey. That's fascinating.
Well, I've been teaching to mental health professionals for, I don't know, maybe it's almost close to 15 years, 12 or 15 years now. And, one of the things I learned about the brain, and I learned this from Rick Hansen, is that the brain is like Velcro for negative experiences. And it's like Teflon for positive ones, right? So when you have a negative experience, you remember. So I was giving a lecture about yoga for depression. And I think it was like a whole day long training, actually. And at the end of the training, a woman came up to me. She was wearing purple readers. I could see her in my mind's eye, you know, with the cat eyes. And she came up to me at the end of the training and she said, well, that was okay, but I thought you were at least going to talk a little bit about what goes on in your brain when you're depressed. She kind of pushed her readers up and I was like, oh, I don't think I know that much about that. And very soon after that, one of my wonderful students, who's also a psychotherapist, came to my class and she had a copy of Buddha's Brain, which was written by Rick Hanson maybe 10 years ago. It was something like that. So she handed me a copy of the book and she was like, read this. And I was like, neuroscience, you know, but I read it and then I couldn't put it down. I was like, oh my God, this is so interesting. And then I just went for it. You know, after that, I was like, I am going to learn how to teach about this stuff because people need to know, you know. So that's my story of why, of how I got into neuroscience.
I think that it's true for a lot of us that, you know, you have that sort of strong experience that sort of changes your direction in a way.
Yeah, for sure.
So give us your website again, please.
It's subtleyoga.com.
Great. And then our course is at arpf.com. Okay. And with this, we have a lot of people thanking you. They're saying really enjoyed this. Your size, excellent presentation. Thank you so much and more. And please remember to check out Kristine's Facebook page if you have any more questions. Yeah. She does answer them there. So thanks for joining us. Thank you so much, Kristine. We're very grateful. Wonderful information. And I wish everyone a good evening, good night, stay safe, be well, keep spreading the light. Bye-bye, everyone.